The wind howling across the jagged Alaskan ridge did not feel like moving air. It felt like teeth. It stripped the heat from a human body in seconds, finding every microscopic seam in the tactical fabric, seeking the warm blood beneath. The temperature was 22 degrees below zero. The snow was a blinding, horizontal wall of white, burying the world in a frozen, featureless purgatory. Delaney Adler lay perfectly still in the center of the storm. She was 28 years old, her face pressed against the freezing composite stock of a Barrett M82A1 sniper rifle. The weapon weighed 30 pounds. It was a massive, brutal piece of engineering designed to tear through engine blocks and light armor at distances that defied the human eye. Right now, it was the only thing standing between the survival of an American SEAL team and their complete slaughter. Her right leg was broken. It was not a hairline fracture you could walk off. The fibula had snapped cleanly hours ago during the infiltration, the jagged edge of the bone scraping against muscle tissue with every agonizing millimeter of movement. She had not asked for a medevac. She had not asked for painkillers. She had silently bound the limb with a split section of a composite ration box and tight wraps of paracord, pulling the knots so hard her knuckles bled. She had walked on that broken leg through 4 miles of mountain terrain, carrying 70 pounds of gear, and she had never uttered a single word of complaint. Down in the valley, through the swirling vortex of the blizzard, a thermal signature glowed faintly green in her scope. 900 yards. A sniper from a rogue private military company had Silas Vaughn and his SEALs pinned behind a rusting steel blast door. The enemy shooter was good. He possessed the high ground, superior cover, and he had already wounded the SEALs' primary marksman. Vaughn, a veteran commander who had spent the last 24 hours doubting the young female medic forced into his unit, was trapped. If Vaughn moved, he died. If his men moved, they died. Delaney slowed her breathing. The pain in her leg was a screaming, white-hot siren in her brain. She took that pain, folded it neatly into a mental box, and locked it away in a dark corner of her mind. She calculated the distance. 900 yards. She calculated the wind. 15 miles per hour, gusting to 20, crossing left to right. She factored in the extreme cold, which thickened the air and dragged on the bullet, dropping its trajectory faster than in warm weather. She did not use a ballistic computer. She did not use a smartphone app. She used the raw, analog mathematics drilled into her mind over 7 years of relentless, agonizing obsession. Her finger rested on the trigger. She found the bottom of her exhale. She found the profound stillness between heartbeats. She squeezed. The Barrett roared, a concussive shockwave that kicked up a cloud of snow around her. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a sledgehammer. Half a mile away, the green thermal signature in her scope simply vanished. The threat was erased. Down in the valley, Silas Vaughn looked up toward the ridge. He could not see her through the storm, but in that moment, the hardened 58-year-old commander realized that everything he had assumed about the quiet young woman attached to his team was fundamentally, disastrously wrong. To understand how Delaney Adler came to be lying on a frozen ridge with a shattered leg and a smoking .50 caliber rifle, you have to go back 48 hours. The briefing room at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage was sterile, smelling of floor wax, ozone, and stale coffee. Silas Vaughn stood at the head of the heavy oak table. At 58, Vaughn possessed the kind of quiet, dangerous stillness that only comes from surviving 3 decades of violence. His face was a roadmap of scars and sun damage, his eyes the color of washed-out denim. He was a relic of an older military, a man who believed in the chain of command, unwavering loyalty, and the sacred bond of the brotherhood. He had bled in the sand of the Middle East, frozen in the mountains of Afghanistan, and buried more friends than he cared to count. Sitting around the table were the men of his element, men he had bled with. Among them was Brody Thorne, 35 years old, thick-necked and heavily tattooed, the team's heavy weapons specialist. Thorne was a man who preferred problems that could be solved with a belt-fed machine gun. He was a blunt instrument, aggressively protective of his team, and fiercely distrustful of outsiders. On the large digital monitor mounted to the wall was the face of General Alden Kincaid. Kincaid was a political creature. At 65, his uniform was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly parted. He had not seen dirt under his fingernails since the 1990s. He waged wars from soundproof rooms in the Pentagon, moving operators across global maps like plastic pieces on a board. Vaughn respected the rank, but he harbored a deep, silent contempt for the man wearing it. The mission, Kincaid explained in his smooth, measured baritone, was a retrieval operation. Deep in the Alaskan interior, buried beneath a mountain of granite and ice, sat an abandoned Titan II missile silo. It was a ghost from the Cold War, a massive underground complex built in the 1960s to house nuclear weapons pointed at the Soviet Union. Decommissioned in the late 80s, the facility had officially been sealed and forgotten. But according to Kincaid, intelligence indicated that a rogue faction of military contractors had quietly breached the silo. They were using the heavily fortified off-the-grid facility to store stolen defense data, a physical hard drive containing Black Book operational protocols. Vaughn's team was to infiltrate the silo, neutralize any resistance, recover the drive, and exfiltrate before a massive winter storm grounded all air support. It was a smash and grab, dangerous given the confined spaces of a subterranean bunker, but nothing Vaughn's men had not handled a dozen times before, in places much hotter and less forgiving than Alaska. There was just one complication. The heavy door of the briefing room opened with a soft click. Delaney Adler walked in. She wore standard-issue fatigues, carrying a heavy medical kit slung over her shoulder. She was 28, lean and athletic, with dark hair pulled back into a tight regulation bun. Her eyes were a pale, striking gray. They were the eyes of someone who was constantly measuring the exits, constantly calculating distances. She did not swagger. She did not shrink. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of supreme physical discipline. General Kincaid's voice echoed from the speakers. "This is Specialist Adler. Your primary medic has been sidelined with a torn rotator cuff. Adler is stepping in. She is fully certified in tactical combat casualty care." Thorne leaned back in his chair, the heavy legs scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. He looked Delaney up and down, his expression radiating undisguised skepticism. "With all due respect, General," Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "we're dropping into a confined underground structure in the middle of a sub-zero blizzard. We don't need a backup medic. We need another shooter. If things go sideways in the dark, a young woman lugging a trauma bag is just going to slow us down. I don't want to be babysitting when the brass starts flying." The room went dead silent. It was an offensive statement, blunt and aggressive. In the modern military, it was the kind of comment that generated paperwork and disciplinary hearings. But this was not the modern military. This was a room full of Tier 1 operators, and Thorne was voicing the unspoken concern of every man at the table. They survived by trusting the man next to them completely. They did not know this woman. They did not trust her. Vaughn watched Delaney closely, waiting for her reaction. He expected her to bristle, to argue, to demand respect based on her rank or her training certificates. He had seen 100 young, unproven soldiers try to talk their way into respect. Delaney did none of those things. She looked calmly at Thorne. She did not frown. She did not smile. She simply held his gaze for 3 long seconds, absorbing his doubt, acknowledging it, and then completely dismissing it. She turned away from him, set her medical bag down on a spare chair, and looked at the map on the table. "I've reviewed the schematics of the Titan II silos," Delaney said. Her voice was steady, devoid of any nervous tremor. "The primary access shafts will be rusted shut or rigged. We will have to use the secondary ventilation ducts on the north face. It requires a fast rope drop of 80 feet into a blind cavern. I am ready to jump when you are, Commander. She did not ask for permission to be there. She simply stated her utility. Vaughn narrowed his eyes. He appreciated the lack of drama, but he was not convinced. The field was the only judge that mattered. Stay in the middle of the stack, Adler, Vaughn said gruffly. Keep your head down, keep your weapons safe, and only open that medical kit if I tell you to. Understood? Understood, she said quietly. What none of the men in that room knew, what even General Kincaid staring from the digital screen did not know, was that Delaney Adler had not been assigned to this mission by accident. She had hacked the deployment roster. She had manipulated the medical rotation schedules. She had spent 7 years moving like a ghost through the military bureaucracy to ensure that she was in this exact room, on this exact day, going to this exact location. She was not there for a hard drive. She was there for a ghost of her own. 20 years ago, in 2006, a SEAL operator with the call sign Phantom Actual had been betrayed during a black operation in the Middle East. He had been left behind, sold out by the very intelligence apparatus that was supposed to guide him. The military declared him killed in action. They folded a flag, handed it to a weeping widow, and closed the file. But 7 years ago, in 2019, 21-year-old Delaney had received a blank envelope in the mail. Inside was a piece of paper with a string of alphanumeric codes. It took her months to break the cipher. When she did, it revealed coordinates. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned Titan II silo in Alaska. Phantom Actual was her father, Garrett Adler. And Delaney knew, with the cold certainty of a daughter who had never stopped grieving, that the man who had sold her father out was currently staring at them from the monitor on the wall. General Alden Kincaid. The infiltration began at 0200 hours. The MH-47 Chinook helicopter tore through the black Alaskan sky, the massive twin rotors beating the freezing air into submission. Inside the cargo bay, the world was bathed in the eerie, blood-red glow of the tactical lights. The noise was deafening, a mechanical roar that vibrated right through the bone marrow. Vaughn sat near the open ramp, the frigid wind whipping his face. He looked down the line of his men. They sat in profound silence, lost in their pre-mission rituals, checking and rechecking gear, racking charging handles, tapping magazines. He looked at Delaney. She sat beside Thorne, her helmet strapped tight, her night vision goggles flipped up. She was checking the seals on her trauma kit. Her movements were precise, methodical. She did not look nervous. She looked like a machine calibrating itself for a violent task. The crew chief held up a single finger. 1 minute. The helicopter flared, slowing as it hovered over a jagged plateau of granite and ice. The pilot could not land. The terrain was too uneven. They would have to fast rope down to a narrow ledge leading to the silo's ventilation shaft. The wind outside was a monster, gusting unpredictably, throwing clouds of blinding snow into the open ramp. Go, go, go! Vaughn went first, grabbing the thick braided rope and sliding down into the dark. Thorne followed, his heavy machine gun strapped tight across his back. Delaney was third. She stepped out onto the edge of the ramp, grabbed the rope with heavy leather gloves, and dropped. The descent was fast. The wind grabbed her instantly, twisting her body in the air. She controlled the spin, keeping her boots locked around the rope, her eyes focused on the narrow stone ledge rushing up to meet her. 10 feet from the ground, the helicopter suddenly lurched upward, hit by a massive thermal updraft. The rope snapped taut, violently yanking Delaney sideways. She swung like a pendulum, flying away from the drop zone. Before she could brace herself, she slammed hard into the sheer granite face of the mountain. The impact was brutal. Her right boot hit a jutting shelf of rock at a terrible angle. Delaney heard the sound before she felt it. A wet, heavy snap, like a thick oak branch breaking under pressure. The sound traveled up her leg and echoed in her skull. She fell the remaining 5 feet, landing in the deep snow on the ledge. For 2 seconds, there was no pain, only the sickening realization of what that sound meant. Then the shock receded, and the agony arrived. It was a blinding, paralyzing wave of torment that washed over her vision in sheets of white. Her fibula, the smaller bone in her lower leg, was fractured. She lay in the snow, gasping, the wind stealing the air from her lungs. She looked up. The rest of the team was already moving toward the dark maw of the ventilation tunnel, their forms shadowy ghosts in the blizzard. No one had seen her hit the wall. The roar of the helicopter and the screaming wind had drowned out the sound of the bone breaking. Delaney squeezed her eyes shut. The pain was begging her to stay down. It was begging her to key her radio, to call for an abort, to tell Vaughn she was broken and needed a medevac hoist. It was the standard protocol. It was the right thing to do. But if she called for a medevac, the mission would be delayed. They would lose the window. She would be pulled out, and Kincaid's trap, whatever it was, would snap shut. She would never find the bottom of the silo. She would never find her father. Delaney opened her eyes. They were completely devoid of fear. She dragged herself toward the rock wall, pulling her body through the snow. She found a thick, rigid piece of rusted metal bracket that had fallen from the old silo infrastructure. It was straight and hard. She pulled a length of 550 paracord from her tactical vest. With shaking hands, she pressed the metal bracket against the outside of her right calf. She wrapped the paracord around her leg, over the thick winter fabric of her uniform, pulling it viciously tight. The pressure forced the broken ends of the bone into a crude alignment. A single, suppressed groan escaped her lips as she pulled the final knot tight. Cold sweat poured down her face, freezing instantly against her skin. She reached for her rifle. Using it as a crutch, she forced herself up. Her right boot touched the snow. She put 10% of her weight on it. The pain spiked, threatening to make her pass out. She breathed through it. She put 20%, then 50. She locked her jaw. She took a step, then another. She limped into the dark mouth of the tunnel, merging seamlessly into the back of the patrol formation, just as Vaughn turned around to check the head count. "Status?" Vaughn whispered over the internal comms. "Up," Thorne grunted. "Up," the others echoed. "Up," Delaney said. Her voice was perfectly level. Not a single tremor betrayed the fire raging in her leg. They moved deeper into the mountain. The transition from the screaming Alaskan blizzard to the interior of the Titan II silo was like stepping into a tomb. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of oxidized iron, damp concrete, and the distinct, oily tang of old hydraulic fluid. It smelled like the 1980s military-industrial complex left to rot in the dark. Vaughn took point, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator. He swept his rifle barrel across the dark spaces, his night vision goggles painting the world in shades of luminous green. The concrete walls were massive, curving around the central missile shaft. Thick bundles of cables hung like dead vines from the ceiling. They descended a rusted metal stairwell, their boots making no sound. Delaney moved carefully. With every step down, the shock of the impact traveled straight up her fractured leg. She altered her gait, masking her limp, absorbing the pain in her core rather than letting it show in her shoulders. She watched the angles. She watched the shadows. They reached sublevel 1, a long, cavernous corridor lined with heavy blast doors that used to house the launch control centers. Vaughn held up a fist. "Stop." He knelt, inspecting the ground. There were fresh tracks in the dust, tactical boots, and the dust was disturbed in a way that suggested recent, heavy movement. "We're not alone," Vaughn whispered. "PMCs. Stay sharp. Check your corners." They moved forward in a tight stack. Thorne was up front, his heavy machine gun tucked tight into his shoulder. Behind him was a young SEAL named Hayes, carrying a breaching shotgun. Delaney was in the middle. They reached an intersection. The corridor branched left and right. Hayes stepped forward to clear the left angle. He never saw the tripwire. It was monofilament, thinner than a human hair, strung ankle-high across the junction. When his boot snapped the line, the world exploded. A directional fragmentation charge, hidden behind a rusted electrical panel, detonated with a deafening, concussive roar. The shockwave slammed into the team, throwing them backward into the concrete walls. A cloud of pulverized concrete and choking gray smoke filled the corridor. Contact front. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the darkness down the hall. Tracers zipped through the smoke, glowing red streaks of death. The enemy was waiting for them, and they were good. They fired in disciplined bursts, covering each other, suppressing the intersection. Thorne roared, stepping out from cover. His Mark 48 machine gun hammered back, spitting a relentless stream of 7.62 NATO rounds down the corridor. The thunder of his weapon drowned out the world. Brass casings rained down on the concrete floor, chiming like a handful of coins. Vaughn was shouting orders, directing fire, organizing the defense. Delaney pushed herself off the ground. Her ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine drowning out the gunfire. She looked through the smoke. Hayes was down. He lay flat on his back, 10 feet away, clutching his chest. He was gasping for air, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating panic. A piece of jagged shrapnel from the trap had torn through his tactical vest, punching a neat, bloody hole into the right side of his chest. "Medic!" "Get to him!" Vaughn roared. The team's backup medic, a young guy named Miller, who had taken the primary role after the original medic was injured, scrambled toward Hayes. Miller was shaking. The ambush had rattled him. He dropped to his knees next to Hayes, ripping open his trauma kit, his hands fumbling with the plastic wrappers of the bandages. Delaney crawled forward, her broken leg dragging behind her. She reached them in seconds. She looked at Hayes. The wound in his chest was sucking air. Every time he tried to inhale, air was pulled through the bullet hole into the chest cavity, but it could not escape. The pressure was building rapidly, collapsing his right lung and pushing his heart and trachea toward the left side of his body. It was a tension pneumothorax. Without immediate intervention, his heart would stop in less than 2 minutes. "Chest seal!" Miller yelled, his voice cracking. "I need a chest seal." He was frantically digging through his bag, pulling out rolls of gauze, dropping them in the dark. "He's past a seal," Delaney said, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. "Look at his neck." Miller looked. In the beam of his tactical flashlight, he could see Hayes's jugular veins bulging against his skin. His trachea was visibly shifted to the left. Hayes's lips were turning a dark, bruised purple. He was drowning in the air trapped inside his own chest. "We have to decompress," Miller stammered. He pulled a long, thick needle from his kit. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the protective cap. He leaned over Hayes, hesitating, staring at the man's chest, trying to remember the exact anatomical landmark under the stress of heavy machine gun fire echoing inches above their heads. Delaney did not hesitate. She reached out, grabbed Miller by the collar of his tactical vest, and shoved him violently out of the way. "Move," she ordered. She knelt over Hayes. She didn't have time to peel back his gear carefully. She took her combat knife, slashed the straps of his rig, and ripped the fabric away to expose his bare, bloody chest. She did not need a flashlight. She did not need to think. She had run this procedure 1,000 times in the dark, in the rain, in the mud. She took the 14-gauge needle from the ground. She found his collarbone with her left hand. She slid her fingers down. First rib, second rib, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Right there. She drove the heavy needle straight down into his chest. It punched through the muscle and into the pleural cavity. Instantly, a loud hiss of trapped air escaped from the catheter, like a punctured tire. The pressure inside Hayes's chest vanished. His left lung expanded. He took a massive, agonizing gasp of air, his eyes flying open. The purple tint began to fade from his lips. Delaney withdrew the needle, leaving the plastic catheter in place to allow the air to continue venting. She slapped a one-way chest seal over the entry wound to secure it. It took her exactly 3 seconds. She didn't wait for Hayes to thank her. She didn't look at Miller, who was staring at her in stunned silence. She grabbed her M4 carbine, rolled to her left, bringing her weapon up to cover the flank. Her face was a mask of pure, unyielding focus. 10 feet away, Silas Vaughn was changing a magazine behind a concrete pillar. He had watched the entire sequence. He had seen medics freeze under fire before. He had seen good men die because the guy with the medical bag couldn't control his adrenaline. But what he had just witnessed from Delaney Adler was something entirely different. It wasn't just competence, it was a cold, calculated ruthlessness. She had moved with a mechanical precision that completely ignored the chaos around her. She didn't act like a young backup medic trying to prove herself. She acted like a veteran who had seen this exact nightmare 100 times before and found it boring. Vaughn slammed the fresh magazine into his rifle and sent the bolt forward. He looked at the woman crouching in the dark, her rifle steady, her eyes scanning for threats. Brody Thorne was wrong. Delaney Adler was not going to slow them down. She was the most dangerous person in the room. "Fall back," Vaughn yelled over the gunfire. "We're pushing right. Move." The team broke contact, laying down a heavy base of suppressing fire as they dragged Hayes around the corner, deeper into the labyrinth of the Titan II silo. Delaney provided rear guard, her rifle barking short, controlled bursts into the dark. Every time she planted her right foot, the broken bones ground together. The pain was nauseating, sending cold spikes of electricity up her spine. She ignored it. She fed it into the furnace of her anger, using it to keep herself hyper-focused. They retreated down a secondary access tunnel, moving away from the main power grid. The emergency lighting here was dead. They were operating in pitch-black darkness, relying entirely on the green glow of their night vision. Vaughn halted the team in a small mechanical room filled with rusted water filtration tanks. It was a dead end, but it offered hard cover and only one point of entry. It was a place to stop, assess the wounded, and figure out how a simple retrieval mission had turned into a bloodbath. "Secure the door," Vaughn ordered. "Thorne, watch the angle." Vaughn crouched next to Hayes. The wounded SEAL was breathing steadily now, the color back in his face, though he was out of the fight. Miller was applying secondary bandages, his hands finely steady, though he kept shooting nervous glances at Delaney. Vaughn stood up and walked over to where Delaney was kneeling by the door, her rifle pointed down the dark hallway. "Good work on the needle," Vaughn said quietly. His voice was no longer gruff. It was measuring. "Just doing my job, Commander," Delaney replied, not taking her eyes off the hallway. "Where did you deploy before this?" Vaughn asked. "I've never deployed, Commander. I've been assigned to the hospital unit at Elmendorf for the last 3 years. Vaughn stared at the side of her face in the green light. That was a lie, or at least, it was a half-truth hiding something massive. "You didn't learn to decompress a chest under heavy machine gun fire with zero hesitation in a sterile hospital ward. You learned that in the dirt." Before Vaughn could press the issue, his radio crackled to life. It was a burst transmission, heavily encrypted. "Vaughn, this is Kincaid. Report status." Vaughn keyed his mic. "We hit heavy resistance on sub-level 1, PMCs. Well-armed, well-organized. They knew we were coming, General. We have 1 man down, stabilized but combat ineffective. Requesting immediate exfil and a quick reaction force to secure the site." There was a long pause on the radio, only the hiss of static. "Negative on the exfil, Commander," Kincaid's voice came back, smooth and detached. "The blizzard has grounded all birds. You are on your own. Proceed with the primary objective. Secure the data drive. Do not abort. I repeat, do not abort. Kincaid out." Vaughn lowered his radio. He looked at Thorne, who shook his head in disgust. "He's leaving us in the meat grinder," Thorne muttered. "Typical brass. Sitting in a warm chair in D.C. while we bleed on concrete." "We follow orders," Vaughn said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "We find the drive. We hold until the weather clears." Delaney lowered her rifle slightly. She looked at Vaughn. She knew the truth. Kincaid was not waiting for the weather to clear. Kincaid had sent them down here to die. The PMCs were not guarding the data drive from the SEALs. The PMCs had been hired by Kincaid to eliminate the SEALs. It was a sanitization operation, and she knew exactly what Kincaid was trying to sanitize. The data drive was a myth. There was no stolen intelligence in the Titan II silo. The only thing hidden in this frozen concrete tomb was a man. A man who had been locked in the dark for 20 years. A man who knew the secrets Alden Kincaid had committed treason to bury. Garrett Adler. Delaney adjusted her grip on her rifle. Her leg throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic pulse. The paracord was biting into her skin, cutting off the circulation. She knew that if she didn't get surgical intervention within the next 12 hours, she risked losing the leg entirely to compartment syndrome or necrosis. She did not care. She would trade the leg for her father's life without a second of hesitation. "We need to go deeper," Delaney said, breaking the silence in the room. Vaughn looked at her. "Deeper? The data core is supposed to be on sublevel 2. "It's not on sublevel 2, she said flatly. "The architecture of these silos includes a sub-basement. Level 4. It's not on the official blueprints. It was designed as a final fallout shelter for the high command. If they are hiding something valuable, it's down there." "How do you know that?" Thorne demanded, his eyes narrowing. "You're a medic." "I read books, Thorne," Delaney replied smoothly. Vaughn stared at her. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that Delaney Adler was holding a deck of cards she wasn't showing. But his instincts were also telling him that she was the most capable operator in the room right now. "We move to sub-level 2, Vaughn decided. "If the drive isn't there, we look for the access to level 4. Thorne, take point. Adler, you're on my 6. They moved out of the mechanical room, slipping back into the dark corridors. The silence of the silo was profound, broken only by the faint, distant hum of a generator somewhere far below. It meant the facility had power. It meant someone was maintaining life support. As they crept down a narrow, descending stairwell, Delaney felt a vibration in the concrete beneath her boots. It was rhythmic, heavy. She held up a hand. "Stop." Vaughn froze. "What is it?" "Listen," she whispered. At first there was nothing. Then Vaughn heard it. The heavy, metallic clank of combat boots on steel grating. It was coming from the corridor below them, and there were a lot of them. "Movement," Thorne whispered, peering through his night vision scope down the stairwell. "I got heat signatures. 6, no, 8 targets. Heavy armor. They're moving in formation. They're hunting us." "We're bottlenecked here," Vaughn said, rapidly assessing the tactical geometry. "If they push up these stairs, they'll chew us to pieces. We need a fallback position with a wider field of fire." "There is a maintenance gantry overlooking the central missile tube," Delaney said quickly. "It's 50 yards back the way we came. We can set up a fatal funnel at the entrance." "Move," Vaughn ordered. They retreated up the stairs, moving as fast as the darkness and their wounded man would allow. Delaney pushed herself harder, ignoring the fiery agony in her leg, her mind calculating angles and distances. They reached the maintenance gantry. It was a wide, steel-grated platform that ringed the massive, empty, cylindrical shaft where the Titan II missile used to sit. The drop into the dark was at least 100 feet. The only way onto the gantry was through a single, heavy steel door. Thorne set up his machine gun behind a rusted control console, aiming the barrel directly at the door. Vaughn took up position behind a thick steel pillar on the left. Delaney knelt behind a stack of metal crates on the right, providing a crossfire angle. "We hold here," Vaughn said. "No one fires until they breach the door. Let them commit." The wait was agonizing. The adrenaline in Delaney's system was a cold, sharp chemical burn. She checked the chamber of her M4. A brass cartridge gleamed in the dim light. She pushed the bolt closed. Outside the heavy steel door, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Then, dead silence. The enemy was stacking up, preparing to breach. Delaney closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She pictured the man locked in a cell somewhere beneath her feet. She pictured the face of Alden Kincaid on the monitor. The heavy steel door suddenly groaned. Sparks flew as a thermal breaching torch cut through the locking mechanism in seconds. The door was kicked open. A flashbang grenade bounced onto the steel grating of the gantry. "Turn away," Vaughn yelled. Delaney buried her face in her shoulder as the grenade detonated with a blinding flash and a deafening crack. Before the sound had even faded, the PMC operators stormed through the door, their rifles raised, moving with the brutal efficiency of highly trained killers. Thorne opened fire. The heavy machine gun roared, turning the doorway into a storm of lead. The first two PMCs were caught in the open, the heavy 7.62 rounds tearing through their body armor, throwing them backward into the corridor. But the others kept coming. They spilled out onto the gantry, diving behind cover, returning fire with disciplined, accurate bursts. Bullets sparked off the steel grates and pinged violently against the concrete walls. Delaney leaned out from behind her crates. She didn't spray. She didn't panic. She fired single, aimed shots. Crack! A PMC trying to flank Thorne took a round in the gap under his arm and collapsed. Crack! Another enemy soldier, rising to throw a grenade, caught a bullet in the throat and fell backward, the grenade dropping harmlessly over the edge of the gantry into the dark abyss below. She moved like a machine, her breath steady, her eyes cold. She was a surgeon, and her rifle was the scalpel. Vaughn fired from his position, dropping a man who was trying to push the center. He glanced over at Delaney. She was reloading, her hands moving in a blur of practiced muscle memory. The empty magazine hit the grating. A fresh one was seated, the bolt released, and she was back in the fight in under 2 seconds. But there were too many of them. The PMCs realized they were caught in a crossfire. Their team leader, pinned behind a metal pillar, shouted a command. Two of the contractors slung their rifles and pulled out heavy, tube-shaped weapons, light anti-armor weapons, rocket launchers. "RPG!" Thorne screamed. The contractor aimed the launcher directly at the control console where Thorne was hunkered down. He braced his feet, preparing to fire. If that rocket hit the console, the explosion would wipe out Thorne and tear the gantry apart. Delaney didn't have a clear shot. A thick steel pipe was blocking her line of sight to the man with the launcher. She had to move. She abandoned her cover. She stepped out into the open, completely exposed to the enemy fire. She threw her weight under her broken right leg. The bone ground violently. A wave of blackness threatened to overtake her vision. She screamed, a raw, primal sound of absolute exertion, and took 2 agonizing steps to the left, clearing the steel pipe. She raised her rifle. The PMC had his finger on the trigger of the rocket launcher. Delaney fired. The 5.56 round hit the contractor square in the center of his face mask. His head snapped back, his finger clenching in a death spasm. The rocket fired, but the trajectory was thrown wildly off course. It streaked upward, missing Thorne by inches, and slammed into the concrete ceiling high above them. The explosion was catastrophic. Massive chunks of concrete and steel rained down from the roof. The blast wave hit the gantry, shaking the entire structure. Delaney was thrown off her feet. She hit the steel grating hard, her broken leg twisting beneath her. The pain was no longer a fire, it was a universe. She lay there gasping, staring up at the raining debris. The remaining PMCs, realizing they had lost their heavy weapons and were taking heavy casualties, broke and retreated back through the doorway, dragging their wounded into the corridor. The gantry fell into a profound silence, save for the sound of falling dust and the heavy breathing of the surviving SEALs. Thorne slowly stood up from behind the console. He looked at the spot where the rocket had hit the ceiling. Then he looked at Delaney, who was lying on the grating, clutching her rifle. He walked over to her. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked down at her. He saw the crude paracord splint on her leg. He saw the blood soaking through the fabric. "You've been walking on that since the drop, haven't you?" Thorne said, his voice quiet. Delaney looked up at him. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Thorne reached down, grabbed the strap of her tactical vest, and effortlessly hauled her to her feet, supporting her weight so she didn't have to put pressure on the broken bone. "I owe you an apology, Adler," Thorne said, looking her dead in the eye. "I said you were going to slow us down. I was wrong. You just saved my life." Delaney took a breath, fighting back the nausea. "We're not done yet, Thorne." Vaughn walked over. His face was grim. He looked at Delaney's leg, then at her face. "How long can you keep moving on that?" Vaughn asked. "As long as I need to, Commander." Vaughn nodded slowly. He didn't doubt her anymore. He didn't know who she really was, or why she was so desperate to push deeper into a suicide trap. But he knew she was not going to quit. "We need to find a defensible position," Vaughn said. "They'll regroup and come back harder. We can't hold this gantry forever." He pulled out a heavy, ruggedized tablet from his pack. It held the digital schematics of the Titan II silo they had been given by Kincaid. He tapped the screen, bringing up the layout of Sublevel 2. "According to this, there's a heavy blast door at the end of the north corridor," Vaughn said, pointing at the screen. "It leads to the command center. If we can get inside and seal the door, we can hold them off while we figure out our next move." Delaney looked at the screen. She shook her head. "Don't trust the map, Commander," she said. "What do you mean?" "Kincaid gave us that map," Delaney said, her voice dropping to a low, hard whisper. "Kincaid sent us down here to die. Why would he give us an accurate schematic of the place he's using as an execution chamber?" Vaughn stared at her. The implication hung in the cold air between them. "Then where do we go?" Vaughn asked. Delaney looked around the massive cylindrical missile shaft. She pointed down into the impenetrable darkness below. "Level 4, she said. "The sub-basement. That's where the secrets are. That's where we make our stand." Vaughn looked down into the abyss. It was a descent into the unknown, into a place that officially did not exist. It was tactical suicide. But as he looked at the young woman leaning on her rifle, her broken leg bound with paracord, her eyes burning with a relentless, terrifying determination, Silas Vaughn realized that the only way out of this trap was to go straight through the jaws of it. "Pack it up," Vaughn ordered the team. "We're going down." The descent into the ghost of the Titan base had only just begun. The descent into the lower levels of the Titan II silo was a journey into a monolithic tomb. The architecture was a brutalist monument to the Cold War, a place built with the sole intention of surviving the end of the world. The walls were poured concrete, 10 feet thick, sweating with decades of subterranean condensation. The air was dead, tasting of iron oxide and decaying insulation. The silence was so heavy it had a physical weight, pressing against the eardrums, broken only by the synchronized tactical footfalls of Silas Vaughn and his surviving SEALs. Delaney Adler walked in the center of the formation. Every downward step on the rusted metal grating was a fresh negotiation with agony. The paracord binding her fractured right fibula was soaked through with blood, freezing into a stiff, dark crust against her uniform. The bone fragments ground together with a sickening friction that radiated straight up her spine. She had been moving on this shattered leg for over 4 hours. Her body was rapidly depleting its reserves of adrenaline, threatening to send her into neurogenic shock. She did not let it happen. She compartmentalized the pain, treating it as just another environmental variable, no different from the sub-zero temperatures or the darkness. She locked her jaw. She kept her rifle raised. She moved. Vaughn took point, his night vision goggles sweeping the cavernous corridors of Sublevel 2. The intelligence General Alden Kincaid had provided promised a data center down here, a server room holding stolen Black Book protocols. It was a lie. The further they pushed into the facility, the more obvious the deception became. There were no servers, There were no rusted relics of the 1980s. The heavy blast doors they encountered were fitted with brand new biometric locks. The security cameras mounted in the corners were modern, high definition, and actively tracking their movements with quiet, motorized whirs. This facility had not been abandoned. It had been secretly repurposed. It was a black site, funded by dark money, operating completely off the grid. Vaughn held up a closed fist. The team halted instantly. He reached for his tactical radio, switching from the short-range internal frequency to the encrypted satellite uplink. He keyed the mic, attempting to establish a connection with the airborne command center. "Command, this is Vaughn. We have a compromised operational environment, requesting immediate exfiltration window." He waited. There was no static. There was no automated handshake protocol. There was nothing but dead air. Vaughn checked the diagnostic display on his radio. The signal was not just failing to connect, it was being actively smothered. Someone had activated a localized electromagnetic jamming field. They were completely severed from the outside world. No air support, no quick reaction force, no rescue. Comms are completely black. Thorne stepped up beside him, his heavy machine gun resting tight against his hip. "They're boxing us in, Commander. Those PMCs upstairs weren't just guarding the perimeter. They were a herding dog. They pushed us down here where the signal can't reach." Vaughn nodded grimly. The men hunting them were not ragtag mercenaries. From the brief firefight on the gantry, Vaughn had seen their gear. They were wearing quad-tube panoramic night vision. They carried suppressed HK-416 assault rifles. They moved with the disciplined, overlapping sectors of fire that only came from years of elite military training. These were former Tier 1 operators, men who had taken the dark money to do the jobs the United States government could not officially sanction. They were a death squad, and Kincaid had sent them. "We keep moving. We find a secondary access shaft, and we climb our way out of this grave." They pushed deeper into the facility, moving through a series of decontamination airlocks that led toward the central missile exhaust bay. It was a staggering expanse of subterranean engineering. The bay was a massive cylindrical cavern, 300 yards across, designed to vent the millions of pounds of thrust from a nuclear launch. A narrow, skeletal steel catwalk spanned the void, connecting their position to the far side of the bay. Below the catwalk was a drop of 200 feet into a dark, flooded retention pool. Vaughn studied the crossing. It was a fatal funnel. No cover, no concealment. If they were caught on that bridge, they would be torn to pieces. "Peterson," Vaughn whispered over the internal comms, gesturing to the team's primary marksman. "Get an optic on the far side. Scan for thermal signatures before we commit." Peterson, a lean SEAL from Montana, dropped to one knee. He rested the barrel of his Mark 11 sniper rifle against the edge of the blast door. Peering through his thermal scope, he swept the far side of the massive cavern, searching the shadows for the telltale bright white glow of human body heat. The cavern was filled with ambient thermal clutter. Old generators, venting steam pipes, leaking hydraulic lines. Peterson strained his eyes, separating the environmental heat from biological heat. "I have a heat source. Upper gantry, far side. Looks like a power box. Wait, it's shifting." That was the only warning they got. The crack of a high-velocity rifle echoed through the cavern with the terrifying roar of a thunderclap. Peterson was thrown violently backward. The enemy bullet, fired from nearly 900 yards away, slammed into the heavy steel scope of his rifle, shattering the optic and driving the weapon back into his shoulder with bone-breaking force. Peterson hit the concrete deck, groaning, his right arm hanging limp and useless. "Sniper! Far side! Elevated!" Thorne immediately laid down a suppressing burst from his machine gun, firing blindly across the massive expanse of the bay. The tracer rounds arched beautifully through the dark, bouncing harmlessly off the thick concrete walls on the far side. The enemy sniper did not return fire. He didn't need to. He had the high ground. He had the range. and he had them perfectly pinned at the only exit. If anyone stepped onto that catwalk, they would be dead before they heard the gunshot. Vaughn dragged Peterson back behind the thick steel frame of the blast door. Delaney was there instantly. She didn't panic. She moved with that same chilling, mechanical efficiency that had saved Hayes earlier. She ran her hands over Peterson's shoulder, feeling the deformity beneath the fabric. Clavicle shattered, severe blunt force trauma. She administered a local analgesic, strapped his arm tight to his chest to immobilize the bone, and moved him safely out of the line of fire. "He's combat ineffective," Delaney stated, her voice calm and flat. Vaughn looked across the cavern. "We can't advance. We can't retreat. If we stay here, their assault element is going to flank us from behind and crush us against this door. We have to eliminate that shooter." Thorne slammed a fresh belt of ammunition into his weapon. "I can't reach him with this, Commander. The spread is too wide at that distance. He's in a fortified nest." Vaughn looked at Peterson's ruined rifle. The optic was destroyed. The action was warped. The team's only precision weapon was garbage. Except it wasn't. Strapped in a heavy drag bag on Peterson's back was the team's anti-materiel weapon, a Barrett M82A1 50 caliber sniper rifle. It was brought along strictly for destroying vehicle engine blocks or penetrating hardened bunkers. It was not a weapon meant for surgical precision against a hidden human target in the dark. It weighed 30 pounds. Its recoil was punishing. Vaughn reached for the drag bag, pulling the massive weapon free. He deployed the heavy steel bipod and rested the rifle on the floor. He looked at it. He was an assault leader, a close quarters specialist. He had not qualified on a long gun in 15 years. To make a 900-yard shot across a subterranean cavern with unpredictable wind drafts and no ballistic computer was a statistical impossibility for him. Delaney Adler stepped forward. Her right leg dragged slightly against the concrete. She unslung her medical bag, letting it drop to the floor. She reached down and took the heavy Barrett 50 caliber rifle from Vaughn's hands. Vaughn stared at her. "Adler, what are you doing?" "I am going to clear the bridge, Commander." She didn't wait for permission. She crawled forward on her elbows and knees, dragging her broken leg behind her until she reached the very edge of the doorway. She pushed the heavy steel bipod of the Barrett out into the open space, resting the massive weapon on the cold concrete ledge. Thorne watched her in disbelief. "Adler, you can't make that shot. You're a medic. That's 900 yards in a wind tunnel. The bullet drop alone is going to be 10 feet. You don't have a kestrel. You don't have an atmospheric app. You're firing blind." Delaney ignored him. She pressed her cheek against the cold composite stock of the rifle. She flipped up the lens caps of the high-power optic. This was her sanctuary. This was the place where all the noise, all the pain, all the fear of the world disappeared. For 7 years, while other young women were living their lives, Delaney had been on isolated firing ranges, in the rain, in the snow, in the blistering heat. She had fired tens of thousands of rounds. She had memorized the ballistic tables until they were burned into her retinas. She had learned to feel the environment, to read the world in analog terms, rejecting the digital crutches that modern snipers relied upon. Batteries die, screens crack, but math is eternal. She looked through the scope. The magnification pulled the far side of the cavern into sharp focus. She found the enemy sniper's nest. It was a small, dark opening in a ventilation grate near the ceiling. She could see the faint thermal bleed of his body heat reflecting off the metal. She began the calculations in her head. Distance, 900 yards. Projectile, 750 grain Hornady AMAX. Muzzle velocity, 2,800 feet per second. She opened her mouth slightly, tasting the air. It was freezing, dense. Dense air causes more drag on the bullet. She mentally adjusted her elevation dial, adding clicks to compensate for the extreme cold. She focused her eyes not on the target, but on the empty space between them. She watched the dust motes swirling in the ambient light. She watched a thin stream of steam venting from a broken pipe halfway across the cavern. The steam blew hard from left to right, then swirled, then blew hard again. Crosswind, 15 miles per hour, gusting. The cavern was acting like a wind tunnel, funneling the drafts into a violent vortex. At 900 yards, a 15-mile-per-hour crosswind would push that heavy .50 caliber bullet over 60 inches off target. She reached up with a gloved hand and adjusted the windage knob on the scope. Not by looking at it, but by feel, counting the clicks. Click, click, click. The pain in her leg flared, demanding her attention. She pushed it down. She slowed her heart rate. She focused entirely on the reticle in the scope. The crosshairs floated in the darkness. She held her aim not on the sniper's nest, but 5 feet to the left and 8 feet high, aiming at nothing but black air, trusting the physics, trusting the math. She exhaled, a long, slow breath that emptied her lungs completely. Her body reached a state of mechanical stillness, the space between heartbeats. She applied 3 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The Barrett erupted. The noise was apocalyptic in the confined space. A massive tongue of orange flame jetted from the muzzle brake. The concussive blast hit the walls and bounced back, shaking dust from the ceiling. The heavy rifle bucked backward, slamming violently into Delaney's shoulder. She absorbed the recoil perfectly, keeping her eye in the scope, watching the trace of the bullet. For 1.5 seconds, the heavy projectile tore through the dark air. It arced upward, fought through the freezing density of the cavern, caught the violent left-to-right crosswind, and curved perfectly back toward the center. On the far side of the cavern, the heavy steel ventilation grate exploded outward in a shower of sparks and shredded metal. The .50 caliber round hit the enemy sniper's center mass. The kinetic energy transfer was catastrophic. The thermal signature in the grate simply vanished, replaced by the rapidly cooling splatter of organic matter against the concrete wall. Delaney smoothly pulled the heavy bolt of the rifle back. A massive smoking brass casing the size of a cigar ejected, clattering onto the concrete floor. She pushed the bolt forward, chambering another round. She held her position, scanning the darkness. "Target destroyed," she said quietly. "The bridge is clear." Behind her, Silas Vaughn and Brody Thorne stared in profound, stunned silence. They were elite warriors. They had seen incredible feats of marksmanship, but what they had just witnessed defied logic. A young medic with no environmental reading equipment, using a borrowed anti-materiel rifle, had just made a surgical, first-round impact at 900 yards in a subterranean crosswind. Thorne swallowed hard. He looked at the smoking barrel of the Barrett, then looked down at Delaney. "Good God!" Vaughn stepped forward. He knelt beside her. The adrenaline of the firefight was momentarily eclipsed by a chilling, terrifying realization. He looked closely at the woman lying on the concrete. He saw the tight, white lines of pain etched around her mouth. He looked down at her right leg. In the chaotic light of the flashlights, the damage was finally obvious. The fabric of her uniform was torn and soaked with dark, freezing blood. The crude paracord wrapping had slipped slightly, revealing the grotesque, swollen deformity of the calf muscle beneath. The lower leg was angled in a way that defied anatomy. "Miller!" Vaughn barked, his voice sharp with sudden alarm. "Get over here now!" The young medic scrambled forward, dropping to his knees beside Delaney. He shined his penlight down the length of her leg. He gasped. "Commander, her leg! The bone is completely sheared." Miller's voice was shaking. "She has severe compartment swelling. The tissue is dying. How long has it been like this?" Delaney did not look at the medic. She kept her eyes locked on the far side of the cavern. "Since the drop." Vaughn felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The drop was over 4 hours ago. 4 hours of combat movement. 4 hours of carrying 70 pounds of gear. 4 hours of climbing stairs and dodging gunfire on a shattered, unmedicated bone. It was a level of pain tolerance that bordered on the psychotic. It was the kind of endurance Vaughn had only seen in one other human being in his entire life. "We need to splint this properly," Miller said, his hands hovering over the ruined leg, afraid to touch it. "I need to administer morphine immediately. Her heart rate is going to spike. She's going to go into shock." "No narcotics," Delaney said sharply. Her voice left no room for debate. "I need a clear head. Tape it tight. Let's move." Vaughn grabbed Delaney by the shoulder. He turned her forcefully so she had to look at him. His pale denim eyes bore into her. The commander was gone. The man looking at her now was searching for a truth he was terrified to find. "Adler, look at me," Vaughn demanded. "I need a medical sitrep for the official log. Even if we can't transmit it now, I need it on the record. Give me your full designation and call sign." Delaney looked at the older man. The silence between them stretched, heavy and profound. The air in the Titan silo felt suddenly colder. She had waited 7 years for this moment. She had rebuilt her entire life, broken her own body, and marched into a frozen hell just to look this man in the eye and speak 2 words. She did not blink. Phantom actual. The words left her mouth quietly, but they hit Silas Vaughn with the concussive force of a physical blow. Vaughn froze. All the color drained from his weathered face. His breathing stopped. His hand, gripping her shoulder, trembled violently. He stared at her, his eyes wide, his mind desperately trying to reject what his ears had just heard. Thorne, standing behind them, frowned in confusion. "Commander? What is it?" Vaughn didn't hear him. He was no longer in an abandoned missile silo in Alaska. He was transported back 20 years. He was back in the burning, blood-soaked streets of a nameless city in the Middle East. It was 2006. The air smelled of cordite and burning rubber. He was young. He was pinned down in a crumbling building. And the man covering his flank, the man who held the line so Vaughn could drag his wounded brothers to safety, the man who stayed behind as the enemy swarmed the compound, was Garrett Adler, his best friend, his brother. Call sign, Phantom Actual. Vaughn had watched the building collapse in a hail of rocket fire. He had sat in the debriefing room at the Pentagon and listened to General Alden Kincaid explain how the intelligence was flawed, how the target was moved, how Garrett Adler had made the ultimate sacrifice for his country. Vaughn had carried the agonizing weight of that survivor's guilt every single day for 2 decades. Vaughn slowly released his grip on Delaney's shoulder. He rocked back on his heels. "Garrett," Vaughn whispered, his voice cracking. "Your father was Garrett Adler." "Yes," she said, "but Garrett is dead. I was there. I watched the compound fall." "He didn't die, Commander." Delaney's voice was remarkably gentle, yet as hard as diamond. "He was captured. He was traded." Vaughn shook his head violently. "No. Command said he was KIA. They gave your mother a flag." "They gave my mother a lie." Delaney reached into the tactical pouch on her chest rig. Her fingers, stained with dirt and her own blood, pulled out a small, folded piece of paper encased in a waterproof sleeve. It was weathered, the ink faded, the paper brittle with age. She held it out to Vaughn. 7 years ago, this arrived in the mail. No return address. It was routed through a dark web proxy server in Eastern Europe, then printed and mailed from a post office in Virginia. It was a letter. Vaughn took the plastic sleeve with trembling hands. He shined his flashlight on the paper. It was a series of mundane sentences about the weather, about an old fishing trip on a lake that didn't exist. It made no sense. "It's an analog cipher," Delaney explained. "A one-time pad encryption based on the page numbers of a specific field manual from 1998. It took me 6 months to break it. When I did, it gave me a set of GPS coordinates. These coordinates." She pointed a finger at the concrete floor of the Titan silo. "My father is alive, Commander. He is being held in a black site cell at the very bottom of this facility, on level 4. He has been down here in the dark for 20 years. Vaughn stared at the letter. His mind was racing, connecting terrifying dots. If Garrett was alive, if he had been held here in an American black site, then the intelligence failure in 2006 was not a mistake. It was intentional. Kincaid. Vaughn breathed the name like a curse. Delaney nodded. Kincaid was the intelligence handler for that mission. He sold my father's position to a hostile government in exchange for access to a uranium smuggling network. It was a career-making intelligence coup for Kincaid. He got his stars. My father got a cage. But why bring him here? Thorne asked, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. Why keep him alive? Leverage, Delaney said. My father knew Kincaid was dirty. He had gathered evidence before the mission. Kincaid couldn't kill him without risking a dead man's switch releasing that evidence. So Kincaid made him vanish. He buried him in a hole that doesn't exist on any map. Vaughn looked at the men around him. He looked at Thorne. He looked at Miller. He looked at the wounded Peterson. Then why send us? Vaughn asked, the horrific reality of their situation finally settling over him like a suffocating blanket. If Kincaid is hiding him here, why send a SEAL team to breach the facility? Because the dead man's switch expired, Delaney said coldly. My father is no longer useful. He is just a liability. Kincaid needs to sanitize this facility. He needs to erase the evidence, erase the prisoner, and erase the men who do the erasing. She looked Vaughn dead in the eye. We are not a retrieval team, Commander. We are the cleanup crew. And those PMCs upstairs, they are the cleanup crew for the cleanup crew. Kincaid sent us here to fight our way in, take the casualties, exhaust our ammunition, and die. When we are all dead, the PMCs will collapse the silo, burying my father and us beneath 1,000,000 tons of granite. The official report will say we died in a tragic training accident in the Alaskan wilderness. Kincaid retires with a pension. The ghosts stay buried. The silence in the cavern was profound. The cold reality of the betrayal hit the men harder than the sub-zero wind. They had given their lives, their bodies, their unwavering loyalty to the uniform. And the man wearing the stars on that uniform had thrown them into a meat grinder to cover up his own treason. Thorne's massive hands tightened around the grip of his machine gun. The knuckles turned white. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like steel cables. That son of a bitch, Thorne growled. That immaculate Pentagon son of a bitch. Vaughn stood up. He walked to the edge of the cavern, looking out into the pitch-black void. He felt a profound, exhausting age settle into his bones. He had spent his life following orders. He had trusted the chain of command. Now that chain was a noose around his neck. He turned back to look at Delaney. She was still sitting on the floor, her broken legs stretched out awkwardly in front of her. She was a 28-year-old medic. She had no authority. She had no rank to command a Tier 1 operational element, but she had outshot them. She had out-endured them. She had seen the trap while they walked blindly into it, and she carried the blood of Garrett Adler in her veins. Vaughn walked back to her. He didn't look down at her as a subordinate. He looked at her as an equal. He looked at her as the commanding officer of her own war. You hacked the roster to get on this team, Vaughn said. It was a statement, not a question. Yes. You knew it was a suicide mission. Yes. And you walked in anyway, to save a man you haven't seen since you were a child, on a leg that should have put you in a trauma ward. I am not leaving this mountain without him, Commander. Delaney's voice was steady. The loyalty in her eyes was a terrifying, beautiful thing. It was the purest expression of honor Vaughn had seen in 20 years. Vaughn reached down and hauled Delaney to her feet. He supported her weight, keeping the pressure off her ruined leg. He looked at Thorne. He looked at Miller. General Kincaid issued an order to retrieve a data drive, Vaughn said, his voice echoing in the cavern, hard and resonant. That order was unlawful. That order was treason. We are no longer operating under the authority of the Pentagon. Vaughn unclipped his encrypted radio from his vest, the radio that was supposed to be their lifeline to Kincaid. He threw it onto the concrete floor. He raised the heel of his heavy combat boot and brought it down violently, smashing the radio into 100 pieces of shattered plastic and silicon. As of this moment, Vaughn announced, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury, we are operating under the authority of the Brotherhood. We are going to level 4. We are going to find Garrett Adler, and we are going to burn this facility to the ground. Thorne racked the bolt of his heavy machine gun. The metallic clack was the loudest sound in the world. Copy that, Commander. Let's go hunt. Delaney Adler leaned heavily against the concrete wall. She took a deep breath of the freezing air. The pain in her leg was excruciating, a relentless fire that threatened to consume her. But as she looked at Silas Vaughn and his men who had just committed mutiny to stand beside her, the fire transformed. It was no longer just pain, it was fuel. We crossed the bridge, Delaney said, her voice ringing with the natural authority of a leader stepping into the light. We move fast. They know we're here. They know the sniper is down. The assault team will be moving to intercept. She took a step forward. Thorne immediately moved to her side, offering his shoulder as a crutch. She didn't refuse it. They were a team now, bound by blood, by betrayal, and by a singular, unyielding purpose. They stepped out onto the narrow steel catwalk, leaving the blast door behind. Beneath them was a 200-foot drop into black water. Above them were the ghosts of the Cold War. And ahead of them, waiting in the pitch-black darkness of Level 4, was the ghost of Phantom Actual. The battle for the Titan silo had just begun, and Alden Kincaid was about to learn a terrifying lesson about the men he had thrown away. They do not die quietly, and they never, ever forget. The heavy steel grating of the catwalk groaned under their boots as Silas Vaughn and his men crossed the massive subterranean void. The air in the Titan II silo was dead, heavy with the weight of millions of tons of granite pressing down from above. Beneath them, the black water of the flooded retention pool lay perfectly still, a lightless mirror waiting to swallow anyone who slipped. Delaney Adler did not look down. She kept her eyes locked on the massive blast door waiting on the far side of the abyss. The paracord binding her shattered right leg was cutting so deeply into her flesh that she could no longer feel her toes. Her calf was a swollen, discolored mass of dying tissue and grinding bone. Every step was a brutal negotiation with her own nervous system. Her brain screamed at her to collapse, to lie down on the cold steel and surrender to the shock. She answered that scream with a cold, relentless silence. She leaned her weight onto her M4 carbine, using it as a crude crutch, and kept walking. Brody Thorne walked half a step behind her, his massive frame shielding her back. He kept his heavy machine gun raised, sweeping the dark upper galleries where the enemy sniper had died just minutes before. He watched the way Delaney moved. He saw the violent tremor in her shoulders every time her right boot touched the metal grating. He had carried grown men who wept from lesser injuries. This 28-year-old woman was carrying the weight of a 20-year betrayal, and she was doing it without making a single sound. The profound respect Thorne felt for her in that moment fundamentally altered how he viewed the world. They reached the far ledge. The blast door leading to Sublevel 4 was a monolithic slab of reinforced steel, sealed shut by a digital locking mechanism that glowed with a dull, angry red light. Vaughn stepped up to the terminal. He wiped the dust from the keypad. It was dead to any standard override codes. He looked back at his men. Peterson was slumped against the wall, cradling his shattered arm. Hayes was breathing shallowly, the plastic chest seal Delaney had applied rising and falling with a wet, sticky sound. Miller was watching the rear, his eyes wide with the exhaustion that comes from prolonged terror. "We need to cut through," Vaughn ordered, looking at Thorne. "Get the thermal torch." Before Thorne could unsling the heavy cutting gear from his pack, a sound echoed through the cavern. It was not the sound of boots. It was a low, mechanical hiss. Deep within the walls of the silo, heavy industrial valves were turning. The massive ventilation turbines, dormant for decades, suddenly shrieked to life with a deafening metallic grind. The air pressure in the cavern dropped instantly, popping their eardrums. Vaughn whipped his head around, his tactical flashlight cutting through the dark. From the ceiling vents 50 feet above them, a thick, heavy white fog began to cascade downward. It did not drift like smoke. It poured like a liquid, heavy and unnatural, hugging the concrete walls and rolling toward the floor of the catwalk. "Gas!" Thorne yelled, taking a step back. Vaughn recognized the faint, sweet smell of rotting fruit carrying on the sudden draft. It was an organophosphate nerve agent, sarin, or something worse, synthesized in a black laboratory. General Alden Kincaid had realized his hit squad had failed. He had realized the SEALs were pushing deeper into the facility. Kincaid was executing his final sanction. He was flooding the entire lower section of the silo to ensure nothing biological survived. "Masks on!" Vaughn roared over the sound of the turbines. The men scrambled for their tactical respirators, pulling the heavy rubber masks over their faces and tightening the straps. But Vaughn knew it was a futile gesture. Their standard-issue filters were designed for riot control gas, not military-grade nerve agents. Within 10 minutes, the chemical would eat through the charcoal lining. It would absorb through their exposed skin. Their nervous systems would short-circuit, their lungs would paralyze, and they would drown in their own fluids on the cold concrete. "We have less than 5 minutes before this whole bay is saturated," Vaughn said, his voice muffled through his respirator. "We can't cut through that door in time. The torch takes 15 minutes to burn through 3 inches of hardened steel." He looked at the white fog creeping across the catwalk, swallowing the steel grates. He looked at his wounded men. He looked at Delaney. Vaughn made the only decision a commanding officer of his generation knew how to make. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a block of C4 plastic explosive and a remote detonator. "Thorne, you take the men. Take Adler. Move back across the catwalk. Climb the secondary maintenance shaft we passed on level 2. It vents to the surface. It will be a hard climb, but the gas is heavier than air. It will settle down here. You can outrun it." "What about you, Commander?" Thorne asked, though the grim look in Vaughn's eyes already provided the answer. "I'm going to pack this C4 into the primary ventilation intake above this door," Vaughn said, pointing to a massive grated tunnel directly above them. "When I blow it, the structural collapse will seal this section. It will buy you the time you need to climb. And you'll be trapped on this side of the collapse," Delaney said. Her voice was steady, echoing slightly through her mask. Vaughn looked at her. "I left your father behind 20 years ago, Adler. I have lived with that ghost every single day. I am not leaving his daughter down here. Go. That is an order." Delaney Adler did not move. She looked at the creeping white fog. She looked at the massive intake tunnel above the door. She looked at the structural blueprints she had memorized over 7 years of obsessive study. She understood the fluid dynamics of enclosed subterranean spaces. She understood physics. "No, Commander," Delaney said. Vaughn stepped toward her, his anger flaring. "I gave you an order, Specialist." "Your order is based on bad math," Delaney shot back, refusing to yield an inch. "If you blow the intake, you won't seal the gas. The pressure differential will force the chemical agent straight up the maintenance shaft you want us to climb. You will kill us all, and you will die for nothing." Vaughn stopped. The cold certainty in her eyes gave him pause. "What is your alternative?" "We don't seal the tunnel," Delaney said, pointing up at the massive steel grating of the intake. "We use it. The turbines Kincaid activated are pumping the gas down. But this facility was designed to vent million-degree rocket exhaust out of the mountain in seconds. If we breach the main exhaust manifold behind that wall, the natural vacuum of the Alaskan wind rushing across the mountain peak will create an updraft so violent it will suck every ounce of air out of this room. It will pull the gas up and out," Thorne realized, looking at the ceiling. "Exactly," Delaney said. But we don't need a 15-minute thermal cut. We need brute force. Pack the C4 directly onto the locking hinges of this blast door. We blow the door inward. The explosion will shatter the hinges, giving us entry, and the overpressure from the blast will rupture the weakened exhaust manifold behind it. It was a brilliant, incredibly dangerous piece of analog engineering. It required precise placement of the explosives. If they used too little, the door would hold. If they used too much, the concussive wave bouncing off the thick concrete walls would turn their internal organs to jelly. "Do it," Vaughn ordered. Thorne moved with terrifying speed. He took the blocks of C4 from Vaughn, molding the pale, clay-like explosive directly onto the massive steel hinges of the blast door. He jammed the blasting caps deep into the center of the charges, unspooling the firing wire as he backed away. "Everyone back! Get behind the pillars! Open your mouths and cover your ears!" Thorne yelled. Delaney dragged herself behind a thick concrete support column. She opened her mouth to equalize the pressure in her sinuses, clamping her hands hard over her ears. Thorne squeezed the detonator. The explosion was a physical entity. It ripped the air out of their lungs. A blinding flash of orange fire illuminated the cavern, followed instantly by a shockwave that lifted Delaney off the ground and slammed her back against the concrete. Dust and pulverized rock rained down in a deafening cascade. The heavy blast door, weighing over 4 tons, was ripped from its frame. It crashed backward into the darkness of sublevel 4 with a sound like a freight train derailing. For 5 seconds, the air was completely still. Then, Delaney's theory became reality. The explosion had cracked the massive exhaust manifold deep inside the walls. The violent, freezing wind tearing across the Alaskan mountain peak hundreds of feet above them found the breach. A massive, howling updraft was born. The pressure in the room inverted. The white, creeping fog of the nerve agent suddenly stopped its advance. It whipped backward, swirling into a violent vortex before being sucked violently upward into the ceiling vents and out through the ruptured manifold. The air was ripped from the cavern, replaced by the freezing, clean draft of the outside world. "Clear," Thorne coughed, pulling his mask down. Vaughn stood up, shaking the concrete dust from his shoulders. He looked at the gaping black hole where the blast door used to be. He looked at Delaney. She was leaning heavily against the pillar, her eyes closed, fighting to stay conscious. "You saved us, Adler," Vaughn said quietly. Delaney opened her eyes. "Let's go get him." They stepped over the ruined steel door and descended into the pitch-black darkness of sublevel 4. This was the true black site. There were no fluorescent lights here. There was no hum of standard machinery. The walls were raw, unfinished rock and thick plates of welded iron. The air was freezing, carrying the undeniable scent of prolonged human isolation. It smelled like a medieval dungeon buried beneath modern concrete. They moved down a narrow corridor lined with solid iron doors. Most were hanging open, their interiors empty, coated in decades of dust. But at the very end of the hall, a single door stood closed. A small green LED light blinked steadily on a modern electronic lockbox mounted to the stone wall. "Power," Vaughn whispered. Thorne stepped up to the lock. He didn't bother trying to hack it. He raised the barrel of his heavy machine gun and fired a 3-round burst point blank into the electronic housing. The plastic and silicon shattered. Sparks showered the floor. The heavy internal deadbolt released with a loud, metallic clack. Vaughn reached out. His hand was trembling. He had commanded men in the most hostile environments on Earth, but pushing this door open was the hardest physical act of his life. The heavy iron swung outward. The cell was 10 feet by 10 feet. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh, unforgiving light. There was a stainless steel toilet in the corner, a metal cot bolted to the floor, and a small table. Sitting on the edge of the cot was a man. He wore faded gray prison scrubs, threadbare and stained. He was terrifyingly thin, his body stripped of all excess weight, leaving only dense, corded muscle and bone. His hair and beard were completely white, falling shaggy and unkempt around his shoulders. His face was a map of deep lines in old white scars, but it was his eyes that stopped the SEAL team in their tracks. They were not the eyes of a broken man. They were not the eyes of an animal driven mad by 20 years of sensory deprivation. They were pale gray, sharp as shattered glass, and strikingly lucid. They were the eyes of a Tier 1 operator who had simply been waiting for his extraction. Silas Vaughn took a step into the room. His rifle hung loose on its sling. He stared at the ghost of his past, the guilt of 2 decades crashing down upon him in a suffocating wave. "Garrett," Vaughn choked out, the word barely a whisper. Garrett Adler looked up. He studied Vaughn's face, tracing the lines of age, the gray in his hair. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff but deliberate. He stood at his full height, still an imposing figure despite the starvation. "You got old, Silas," Garrett said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rasp, unused to speaking but carrying a quiet, terrifying authority. Vaughn let out a breath that was half a sob. "I thought you were dead. Kincaid told us the building collapsed. I left you behind. I'm sorry. My God, Garrett, I am so sorry." Garrett shook his head slowly. "You followed orders, Silas. You brought the boys home. Kincaid sold the coordinates. I knew it the moment the door was kicked in. He wanted the black books I found in Fallujah. He put me in this hole so I couldn't testify." Garrett stepped forward, placing a heavy, calloused hand on Vaughn's shoulder. "You didn't leave me behind. You came back." "It wasn't me," Vaughn said, his voice thick with emotion. He stepped aside, turning his body toward the doorway. Garrett looked past his old friend. He looked at the heavily armed men standing in the hall. And then he saw her. Delaney Adler stepped into the harsh light of the cell. Her face was smeared with dirt, concrete dust, and dried blood. She was leaning heavily on her rifle, her ruined right leg dragging behind her. The paracord splint was a gruesome mess. She looked like she had walked through hell. But her pale gray eyes, the exact mirror of the man standing in front of her, were shining with a fierce, unbreakable light. Garrett Adler stared at her. For 20 years, he had held on to a memory of an 8-year-old girl with scraped knees and a serious smile. He had spent thousands of hours in the dark, picturing what she would look like, praying she had lived a quiet, safe life, far away from the violence that had consumed him. Now she was standing in front of him, wearing a blood-soaked tactical uniform, carrying a rifle, having breached one of the most secure black sites on the planet. Garrett's eyes dropped to the heavy trauma bag slung over her shoulder. Then he looked at the gruesome angle of her broken leg. He saw the way she was distributing her weight, the masterful control over her own pain response. It was the discipline of a master sniper. It was his discipline. "Delaney," Garrett whispered. She did not cry. She did not collapse into his arms. She stood at attention, the ultimate professional, honoring the man in front of her the only way a soldier knew how. "I told Mom I was going to medical school," Delaney said, her voice steady, though a small, fiercely proud smile touched the corners of her mouth. "I lied." Garrett Adler looked at the blood, the gear, the impossible resilience radiating from his daughter. He felt a profound, overwhelming surge of pride that threatened to crack his chest wide open. He reached out and gently touched the side of her face, his rough thumb wiping away a streak of concrete dust. "You're still as stubborn as ever," he said softly. "We need to move," Thorne interrupted, his voice tight. "The reunion is over. We have company." From the corridor outside, they heard the distinct sound of heavy boots hitting the metal stairs. Not the chaotic rush of mercenaries. This was a synchronized, tactical advance. "Kincaid sent his personal detail," Garrett said, his eyes instantly turning cold, transitioning from a father back to a soldier in a fraction of a second. "Black Ops. They won't negotiate. They are here to sanitize the site." "Is there another way out?" Vaughn asked. "There is an old emergency blowout shaft at the end of the hall," Garrett said, moving toward the door. "It leads straight up to the surface. but the heavy blast doors locking it will take at least 5 minutes to manually crank open. We don't have 5 minutes, Thorne grunted, raising his machine gun. We buy the time, Delaney said. She limped out of the cell, moving down the dark corridor until she found a narrow choke point where the hallway turned. It was a perfect, fatal funnel. Anyone coming around that corner would have to step into the open. Delaney dropped to the floor. The impact sent a blinding flash of agony through her leg. She gritted her teeth, tasting copper in her mouth. She pulled the heavy Barrett .50 caliber rifle around, deploying the bipod on the cold stone. She was no longer just a medic. She was the anchor of their defense. Get to the shaft, Delaney ordered Vaughn. Get it open. Thorne, you're with me. Vaughn didn't argue. He grabbed Garrett and the wounded men, dragging them toward the heavy iron wheel at the end of the hall that controlled the emergency escape shaft. Thorne took up position beside Delaney, his massive body pressed against the stone wall. He checked the belt of his Mark 48. He looked down at the young woman lying on the floor. You got enough blood left in you for this, Adler? Thorne asked, a grim smile on his face. Just keep them off my flank, Thorne. Delaney racked the heavy bolt of the Barrett. The first Black Ops soldier came around the corner. He was fully armored in heavy black ballistic plates, a suppressed rifle raised to his shoulder. Delaney fired. The deafening roar of the .50 caliber weapon shook the dust from the ceiling. The massive bullet hit the soldier square in the chest plate. The armor was designed to stop standard rifle rounds, but it was useless against anti-material ordnance. The kinetic force shattered the ceramic plate, lifting the massive soldier off his feet and throwing him backward into the men behind him. Contact front, Thorne roared, stepping out and unleashing a relentless wall of lead down the hallway. The corridor erupted into a storm of violence. The Black Ops team was elite. They didn't retreat. They threw flashbangs, trying to blind the defenders, but Delaney and Thorne had already closed their eyes, anticipating the blasts. They returned fire with devastating accuracy. Delaney fired again, and again. The heavy recoil of the Barrett was slowly pulverizing her shoulder, but her aim remained flawless. Every time an enemy soldier tried to step out from cover to throw a grenade or lay down suppressing fire, she put a half-inch piece of lead through their center of mass. She was operating purely on muscle memory and rage. The pain in her leg had transcended physical sensation. It was simply a cold, dark place in her mind. Click. The heavy bolt locked back. The Barrett was empty. Reloading, Delaney shouted, her hands fumbling with the heavy 10-round magazine. Her fingers were slick with sweat and her own blood. She couldn't get the magazine to seat properly. The enemy heard the call. Two Black Ops soldiers rushed the corner, their rifles raised, ready to capitalize on the sniper's empty weapon. Thorne saw them. His machine gun was running hot, the barrel glowing a dull red in the dark. He didn't have time to pivot his weapon. Without a second thought, Brody Thorne stepped completely out from cover. He stood directly over Delaney, turning his massive, armor-plated back toward the enemy fire, acting as a human shield. Hold the line, Adler, Thorne bellowed. Sparks flew off Thorne's back as enemy bullets slammed into his ballistic plates. He grunted with every impact, the sheer kinetic force driving the breath from his lungs. The ceramic plates were cracking. The Kevlar was shredding, but he did not fall. He stood over her like an ancient statue, absorbing the hatred meant for her. Delaney slammed the fresh magazine into the Barrett. She slapped the bolt release. Clear! Get down! She screamed. Thorne dropped to his knees. Delaney fired two rapid shots over his head. The thunder of the weapon deafened them both. The two advancing enemy soldiers fell, their bodies torn apart by the heavy ordnance. The hallway went quiet. The remaining enemy soldiers pulled back, realizing that the choke point was a meat grinder they could not pass. From the end of the hall, Vaughn shouted, "We have the shaft open! Move! Move!" Thorne grabbed Delaney by the harness of her vest, hauling her to her feet with one massive heave. He supported her weight, keeping himself between her and the dark hallway, as they retreated toward the escape shaft. The emergency blowout shaft was a vertical concrete pipe, 50 feet high, lined with rusted iron rungs leading to a heavy steel grate at the surface. Vaughn was already pushing the wounded men up the ladder. Garrett Adler stood at the base, waiting. Brody Thorne stepped forward, slinging his heavy machine gun tight across his chest. "I've got her, old man," Thorne said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You just focus on getting yourself up." Thorne crouched, and Delaney wrapped her arms tightly around the giant gunner's neck, securing her shattered leg out of the way. Garrett looked at Thorne, offering a single, profound nod of gratitude. Then, the starved, white-haired SEAL turned to the ladder and gripped the rusted iron rungs. His body was a hollow shell of what it used to be, deprived of sunlight and sustenance for 2 decades. But as he began to climb, pulling his own weight out of the abyss, one agonizing rung at a time, he moved with a terrifying, unbreakable willpower. He was a Tier 1 SEAL. His muscles were failing, but his spirit refused to die. Thorne climbed right behind him, carrying Delaney through the dark, letting her rest her exhausted head against his armored shoulder as her father led them back into the world of the living. When Garrett reached the top, Vaughn was waiting. He grabbed Garrett's arm and hauled him up onto the frozen ground. They lay in the snow, surrounded by the jagged peaks of the Alaskan mountains. The blizzard had broken. The sky was a vast, piercing expanse of pre-dawn blue. The air was so cold it burned their lungs, but it was the most beautiful thing Delaney had ever tasted. It tasted like freedom. Deep beneath them, the silence of the mountain was broken by a deep, rumbling tremor. The C4 charges Thorne had left on the structural supports of Sublevel 2 detonated. The shock wave traveled up the shaft, blowing a cloud of warm dust into the freezing air. The Titan II silo collapsed in on itself, burying the Black Ops team in 20 years of treason under millions of tons of unbreakable granite. Delaney lay in the snow, looking up at the sky. Her father was kneeling beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Vaughn and Thorne stood guard, their rifles scanning the horizon. They had won. 3 weeks later, the hospital room at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson was quiet. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the dust motes in the air. Delaney Adler sat in a wheelchair by the window. Her right leg was encased in a heavy fiberglass cast, elevated on a padded rest. The surgeons had inserted 2 titanium plates and 14 screws to rebuild the shattered bone. They told her she would walk again, but the military would likely medically discharge her. She didn't care. Her war was over. The door opened. Silas Vaughn walked in. He was wearing his Class A dress uniform, the medals heavy on his chest. He looked older, tired, but the heavy burden of guilt that had shadowed his eyes for 20 years was gone. Vaughn stood at attention. He didn't speak. He slowly, deliberately raised his right hand in a razor-sharp salute. It was not a salute given to a specialist. It was a salute given from one warrior to an equal. It was the ultimate acknowledgement of her endurance, her tactical brilliance, and her unwavering honor. Delaney straightened her back. She returned the salute, her hand crisp against her brow. Vaughn dropped his hand. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He placed it on the table next to her bed. It was a solid gold trident, the special warfare insignia of the Navy SEALs. It was battered and scratched, the gold worn smooth at the edges. "It was Garrett's," Vaughn said quietly. "They took it from him when they buried his file. I made sure it was recovered from Kincaid's personal safe. Your father said he wants you to have it." "Where is Kincaid?" Delaney asked, looking at the golden eagle. Vaughn smiled grimly. "You didn't give the encrypted drive to the Pentagon brass. You sent it directly to the military press and the Inspector General. The story broke an hour ago. The FBI and the military police took Kincaid into custody at his home in Virginia at 0500 this morning. He was in his pajamas. He's going to spend the rest of his life in Leavenworth." Delaney nodded slowly. It was a quiet victory. Not a loud shootout, but the cold, devastating delivery of the truth. "How is he?" Delaney asked softly. Vaughn looked out the window. "He's recovering. He's eating. He's walking in the sun. He has a lot of time to make up for. He's waiting for you." 6 months later, the grass at Arlington National Cemetery was a vibrant, flawless green. The rows of white marble headstones stood in perfect military alignment, stretching out as far as the eye could see. Garrett Adler stood in front of a grave in Section 60. He wore a simple dark suit. He looked healthy, the hollows of his cheeks filled out, his white hair neatly trimmed. He stood with the quiet dignity of a man who had walked through the fire and survived. Beside him stood Delaney. She leaned on a sleek black cane, her right leg still stiff, but she stood tall. She wore civilian clothes. The military chapter of her life was closed. They looked at the white marble headstone. It bore the name Garrett Adler. Below the name were the words, "Killed in Action, Fallujah, 2006. It was a grave holding an empty coffin, a monument to a lie. Garrett reached out with a heavy, calloused hand. He touched the cold marble. He traced the letters of his own name. He had spent 20 years in the dark, believing this piece of stone was the only thing left of his legacy. He turned and looked at his daughter. He saw the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her gray eyes. He saw the woman who had shattered her own body to drag him out of the abyss. He realized then that his legacy was not carved in stone. His legacy was standing right beside him. Delaney reached into her pocket. She pulled out the gold seal trident. She stepped forward and placed it gently on top of the marble headstone. She looked at her father. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. They turned their backs on the empty grave and walked away together, stepping out of the shadows of the past and walking quietly into the light of the future.